for the kind opportunity to speak to you today at the 2023 Taiwan Renewable Procurement Summit. It's my great pleasure to share with you analysis my colleagues around the world do on energy transition. Let me begin by highlighting some good news. Despite the challenges that we have dealt with over the last 3 years, with the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, inflation, and the return of war in Europe, we've continued to see annual investment in energy transition technologies continue to grow. In fact, in 2022, for the first time ever, we saw investment exceed $1 trillion. The continued growth in investment in scale-up of manufacturing of renewable energy technologies, as well as their deployment, has had the impact of reducing the cost of these technologies. In the latter half of the last decade, we saw the global benchmark for levelized cost of electricity generation from solar and wind for the first time become lower than the levelized cost of electricity generation for new thermal power plants. Today, when we look around the world, over 80% of geographies are now at a point where the levelized cost of electricity generation for a solar or a wind power plant, depending on the location, is cheaper than a new thermal power plant. And in fact, in over half of the world, the levelized cost of electricity generation from renewables is already lower than the marginal cost of running existing thermal power plants. Now, as the cost of renewables have come down, and as companies have become more conscious about their emissions, we have seen growing demand for clean power procurement by companies. A very clear indication of this is the number of companies who have signed on to the RE100 initiative launched by the Climate Group. Here in Asia Pacific, just 5 years ago, back in 2018, only about 9 companies had launched initiative to sign on to RE100. Today, there are now over 160 companies that have signed to RE100, and this is great progress. And we are seeing now interest in clean power procurement in Asia Pacific coming from both domestic companies, such as TSMC, but also international companies that operate in the region, such as Amazon and Microsoft. And when it comes to clean power procurement using offshore wind, Taiwan is set to become the world's leading market. Now let's dig a little bit deeper on how companies can procure clean energy. There are different options depending on market regulation, ranging from renewable energy certificates to investment in renewable energy projects, different types of power purchase agreements, as well as on-site generation, for example, using rooftop solar. These approaches entail different levels of complexity, as you can see on the y-axis of this chart, as well as additionality, as you can see on the x-axis. Additionality means the company procuring clean power procurement can lead to increase in overall renewable energy capacity generation. This is a really important factor to consider when we're discussing the different options. The most common approach historically has been virtual power purchase agreements. In this case, the corporate buyer signs a contract with the renewable energy developer, typically procuring on an annual basis a certain volume of electricity, renewable electricity, without worrying about when exactly is the renewable electricity being generated. So typically they look at what their annual consumption is and try to match that number. This type of virtual PPA typically has a fairly simple structure. The corporate buyer benefits when wholesale power prices are above its PPA price, while the developer benefits when the wholesale power prices are below the PPA price. Now, this type of approach became very popular initially in North America, and we have seen growing adoption of this type of model in markets such as Australia and India, where the regulatory mechanisms allow it. Now, by taking this approach, the corporate consumer can really benefit from reducing exposure to volatility of wholesale power markets. At the same time, if wholesale power markets become too volatile, the developer that's providing the renewable energy will be taking a lot of the risk. And eventually this may become very challenging for that developer to undertake. So we're starting to see more and more interest in both shortening the virtual PPA terms in terms of the duration, but also looking at other more complex structures such as sleep PPAs. And this is particularly starting to take off here across APAC markets where the regulations allow it, for example, in Japan. Another option is using green tariffs. So this is when the utility offers a clean electricity retail rate. We're starting to see this become very popular in US states where this is allowed, but also in other markets where the regulatory regimes allow it. Now, in most places where you have a green electricity tariff, they're typically markets where the electricity retail market is already open to competition. This is not always the case in many markets in Asia Pacific, although even in markets in Asia Pacific where electricity retail markets are not open to full competition, we are starting to see incumbent electric utilities offer green tariffs. For example, this is the case in Korea, where Korea Electric Power Company has started offering a green tariff to corporate customers. On-site generation, particularly through rooftop solar, is also very popular. Now, in this case, the corporate consumer has to have the option of selling excess rooftop solar generation to the grid. And in effect, the possibility of using net metering. If net metering policies are in place, then on-site generation can become quite a popular option, as we've seen in Malaysia with its net metering scheme. Certificates are another popular option, particularly in Japan and Korea, but certificates don't always have clear conditions around additionality. So a lot of times the renewable energy certificates are being generated by existing projects. So the buyers of RECs are not necessarily leading to additional investment in expansion of renewable energy capacity. Also, a challenge is that when you look at, for example, the case of Japan and Korea, the growth in supply of RECs will be insufficient to meet the growing demand from corporate buyers of renewable energy. Now, I've covered a little bit the different options that are available. Ultimately, of course, the companies are interested in getting 24/7 clean electricity, so completely decarbonizing their electricity supply. The first company to set such a goal was Google, at least the first major company to do so back in October 2018, but we're seeing rising interest in 24/7 clean power procurement across many different companies. Now, I'm going to walk you through a toolkit of 5 elements that will allow us to explore how we could do 24/7 clean power procurement. The first one is that the companies, of course, need to be experienced buyers of renewable electricity. So the base of achieving 24/7 clean electricity will still be buying a lot of renewables. On this slide, you can see the example of Facebook's parent Meta. Meta has already contracted enough solar and wind capacity to not only meet its annual electricity demand today, but all the way out to 2030. So it's already having a really good base of renewable electricity available to it, at least on an annualized basis. Now, the challenge with solar and wind, of course, is that they only generate when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing. So beyond a certain level, if you try to buy more and more power from solar and wind, you're essentially getting that power at times that you don't necessarily need to supply. So there's a limit around how far you can get with just relying on solar and wind alone. The second component of the toolkit is, of course, the policy and market environment that the company operates. Unfortunately, not all markets currently make it easy for companies to directly sign power purchase agreements with renewable energy developers. There are also cases where there are limitations around wheeling arrangements, around virtual PPAs, sleep PPAs, but also even around net metering. So it's important for companies to continue to engage with their local governments to be able to ensure that they have different options available to them to be able to increase the amount of clean power procurement options that they have. In Asia Pacific, this is particularly an important area. Many markets in Asia Pacific are still served by vertically integrated state-owned monopolies. Now, This doesn't mean that these monopolies cannot provide clean power, but typically in such markets, retail choice is limited, which means corporate consumers cannot directly advocate for having clean electricity supply available to them. Although we are starting to see that more and more movements towards changing this across Asia Pacific. Of course, another important factor is the overall average grid intensity, so the overall supply of electricity in the country. For companies operating, for example, in the Nordics or in Canada, given that the grid emission intensity is already very low, thanks to abundant supply from hydro as well as other renewables and nuclear, these companies, even when they're buying electricity from the grid, from a normal utility, without even putting clean power procurement conditions on it, they're still getting very, very low emission intensity electricity. The message here is that companies also need to continue to engage with their local governments to ensure that the overall supply in the country is transitioning towards low emissions. Companies also need to pay attention to their own demand and try to see if they can make their demand more flexible so that they can be consuming more electricity at times where there's electricity supply from renewables. They could, for example, do this by looking at what processes that they have and see if they can increase demand towards the times where there's high generation from solar and wind, and at other times whether they can reduce demand. They could also look at, as an option, for example, using behind-the-meter energy storage. The demand flexibility can be enabled by different types of software control. Of course, it also depends on the type of company. Typically, software companies such as Microsoft, they have a bit more flexibility when it comes to here than, for example, if you're a steel plant that has to operate on a 24/7 basis. On flexibility, of course, we can look at the supply side. So on this side, for example, companies can also look into investing in energy storage, but also they can look at more dispatchable forms of renewable energy, such as geothermal. For energy storage in particular, we have seen a lot of investments in the US, where companies are essentially investing in energy storage to be able to store excess renewable generation at times that they don't need it, and then be able to draw on that energy storage, holding their renewable electricity when they need it. Now, to look at how companies are progressing across these 5 different elements towards achieving 24/7 clean electricity, we looked at 413 members of RE100 and tried to look at how they're doing on the 5 toolkits that I mentioned. Here you can see the top 10 performers. You can see majority of these are US tech companies. Overall, the average score of the 413 companies was just around 30.7 out of 100. This is not to say that the companies are not striving towards this goal. It's just to say that it's very challenging and there needs to be a lot more work to be done. But I'm hoping today's conference can help with inspiring ideas among all of you to step towards achieving that goal. And I sincerely hope the next time we have a chance to meet, we'll actually have some APAC companies listed among the top 10 shown on this slide. Thank you very much for your kind attention. This concludes my presentation.